Good morning and welcome to our final session of this series, Workplace, Marketplace, Embedding Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Over the past 2 weeks, we've set the stage by talking about creating a space for open dialogue for your employees, for your customers, for your partners, even if that means getting uncomfortable, such as our first session. We then dove deeper into how executives and DEI leaders can get started to create their programs. And today we're taking it to the next step. We're going to be looking at the impact of these programs and how success can be measured. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, Wayfair and Mimecast, and our social justice underwriters, Akamai and PTC. Thank you so much. Akamai and PTC are underwriting our social justice initiatives, including our Tech Compact for Social Justice. If you have not signed on to that, you can do so on our website. We hope to have you involved. Please ask questions throughout. If we can't get in some breaks during the session, we'll definitely be setting a good chunk of time towards the end to take those. So please write as you go. Today we'll hear from those who are in the trenches. Some have been here for a long time, some are newer to this, but they all have a lot to share with you. So I'm very happy to introduce you to our moderator today, Jen Savard, tax partner at PwC.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a tax partner at PwC, and I'm also the diversity partner champion for my practice. PwC's efforts over the past 2 decades have really led to a firm that's embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion as core to our purpose, our culture, and our values. As we've grown bolder in how we approach making DEI a collaborative issue, not just a competitive one. So with that backdrop, I am thrilled to be presenting to you today, joined by 4 amazing professionals who have been championing DEI programs in a year of constant change and uncertainty. So if you want to take a quick wave, Kameelah Benjamin Fuller is the Chief Diversity Officer and Corporate Social Responsibility Leader at PTC. She brings to that role 20 years of experience in building programs both in-house and as a consultant. On the line and not pictured is Elisa Gilmartin. Elisa is the Chief People Officer at Fuze, and she has demonstrated experience of working in the information services industry to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have Kate Gulliver. Kate is the Global Head of Talent at Wayfair, where she brings analytical problem solving and critical thinking skills to the DEI conversation to improve business performance. And Vanessa Spatafora. Vanessa is the Senior Program Manager of Inclusion, Equity, and Belonging at DraftKings, where she uses inclusive talent practices and innovative thinking to approach organizational challenges. So panelists, you each bring a unique background and expertise to this dialogue of measuring success in DEI programs. So I'm really excited to jump right in. Kameelah, I'm going to come to you first to kind of frame some of the history. So you have spent your career driving transformational change as a champion of equity, diversity, and inclusion. How do you think organizations' diversity and inclusion efforts have changed from 3 years ago to today? And have these changes shaped how organizations define diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Thanks, Jen. So good to be here with you all. It's interesting that you start with like the 3-year mark, because there are things that I'm noting from 20 years ago when I started this work at the Gillette company. Gillette and then P&G, they were one of the organizations that were really at the forefront in thinking about the complexities of the work, how it impacts your talent management, how it impacts your customer experience, and how it needs to be sort of thought about in a more global space. So I just want to like set context that there are organizations that have been thinking about this for decades, like even beyond that. But within the last several years, it's mostly been this like quick move from compliance, right? So understanding what are the things that we need to do because there are social pressures or employees that are expecting us to act in a certain way, They're making decisions about where they work based on our commitment to this work or to broader issues of purpose and social impact. So moving from that place of compliance to quickly being asked to be innovative in their space and connect what they're doing to their product, to their business impact. Whether, this was the work that I did at TripAdvisor, where we were thinking not just about our talent in-house, but how our commitment to this work would impact travelers and how they experienced our brand, right? And those are some of the things that we're thinking about now at PTC as well. So it's interesting to see this sort of accelerated movement and maturation from compliance to really integrating it into every part of the business. I've also seen in the past 3 years and in this compressed time period of the last several months of moving from a sense of, well, it's been like guilt, right? So people are acting out of guilt. They're acting out of a little bit of embarrassment of maybe not taking things on earlier, and recognizing the difference between doing that and it forcing you to be performative and just sort of saying things versus actually having substance. And I think we're seeing such a peak right now in interest in events like this and connecting with organizations that have been doing this work for a while, because folks are realizing this is more than just putting out a post on Instagram. It's more than just crafting something for a social moment. Like, there's an expectation that this thing is sustainable. And if it's sustainable, like, oh, we need to now apply the same practices and discipline we do with other parts of the business. And that leads us to like the metrics and measurement conversation.
That's really helpful. And I think it's a good segue to think about, when we think about the role of a chief people officer, it sounds like it's shifting as well. So I think, Elisa, I'm going to come to you because you're a chief people officer. How has that shift in the socio-political climate, do you see that changing that role? And is it even more increasingly an important role for organizations?
It absolutely is. And especially during COVID, as we're all remote, it used to be we didn't talk about religion, politics, any of those things at work. And today we're moving so fast and at such a pace of innovation. We need employees to be able to have a safe spot, to be able to really deal with things and the complexities that we're dealing with in our lives everywhere, and be able to get the support on all of the issues. So as leaders, we need to understand not only that climate, but how it affects our employees all over the world in different ways. And we need to really just learn how to get more comfortable talking about it and applying our same change methods or engagement methods around different issues, and really finding the core of, what are the values of your company? What do you stand for? And it's not necessarily a certain issue, but it's about making sure your employees are safe, making sure your customers are well taken care of, and making sure, for us, these were our 3 guiding principles, you are a good community citizen. And for us, when we find ourselves sort of grounded in those guiding principles and our values of One Fuze, it helps us to really navigate how we then start to have conversations and build strategies around the unique issues at hand that are affecting our employees. No different than wildfires in Australia, where we need to check in with employees and say, are you okay? Really understanding what's happening. There are many situations where we need to, as a team, educate ourselves on things that are happening, understand the impact on our people, our customers, our community, and put a plan in place that really makes sense for us to take care of one another, right? For us, we have One Fuze as a value. How do we support one another? How do we understand what our unique needs are? And how do we holistically address things up front and provide support in different areas that allow us all to be happy, included, and effective? And again, today, with the complexities, that includes a lot of pressures at home. And just trying to help sort of compartmentalize those those items and really put in place a plan that helps to support everybody.
I think those are really really important aspects, and I heard a lot of similar kind of themes around having that plan have substance, having that plan be aligned with the business and the purpose and the values, and really kind of a nice transition to talk more about company culture, right? And so I think what I'm hearing is addressing diversity and inclusion involves a large cultural change, and that often has to start at the top. So Kate, I'm going to come to you. If you could tell us a little bit about how your leadership team at Wayfair is measuring success around DEI efforts.
Sure, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for managing the panel, Jen, and for hosting this, Sarah. So I agree with you, it has to come from the top, but I actually think the best success is driven from both a top-down effort and a bottoms-up organic push. And I would say at Wayfair, in many ways, our team members and employees have actually pushed us farther than maybe leadership would have gotten on our own. And so I have to give credit to all of the Wayfarians who consistently are asking for this data. And then I'll pivot in a second to explain what the data is. But that constant, can I see this? Can I look at this? What do you see happening here? And so if you're in an organization and you're not at the leadership level and you're listening to this panel, you can actually have a huge impact by asking for this from your leaders and saying, I think it's really important to measure this. Are we measuring this? And so I do want to make that really clear. You were talking about company culture and how that influences. Wayfair is a very data-driven company, as I'm sure every company on the phone is, particularly e-commerce. The beautiful thing about e-commerce is you can track every single click, not in a creepy way, but in a totally, appropriate way. And so when we started pushing more of and evolving our DEI work and approach, we actually knew we had to lead with data because that was the language of the organization. And we actually established a DEI analytics team that actually reports into our talent analytics team, but has a very tight relationship with Kiana Schmiedel, who some of you who've been on the prior weeks may have met, who's our amazing head of DEI. And that team has set up a few different things, and I'll just touch on one really key piece right now. We can get into more later, which is our DEI Scorecard. And that DEI Scorecard is accessible for anybody in leadership. So anybody who's a director and above. It's about 700 people in our 16,000 person company. And they can pull up at any time in our talent analytics tool and see representation data, attrition data by race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation. They can see engagement data. And they can understand, if based on our goals, we have certain goals that we're trying to reach on representation, on engagement, how am I doing managing my own team? And where are we, on achieving those goals, and where do I see problems? And we were talking about this, Jen and I were talking about this a little bit before the call, but part of the reason why we think that, seeing that whole picture of that data is so important is because I think it's easy to anchor on one stat to say, hey, I'm trying to drive representation. But if you're just trying to drive representation, you're not focused on the fact that actually, some of your underrepresented groups are not as engaged, feeling not as included, and therefore attriting out faster, then you're never going to actually be able to move the needle on representation because you have a leaky funnel problem and you're losing people at the bottom. So we've really been pushing this DEI scorecard to enable our leaders to actually get in and own the work themselves within their organization, of course, with the support of our central team. But I think it's really important that each leader feel the responsibility for it and be have a full understanding of the data as it pertains to their organization.
I really like how you said that, the leaky funnel problem. I think for diversity, equity, inclusion, to make progress, it sounds like you can't just have one piece right. So getting that representation, the data can tell us something. And I really like how you said that they all have to work together to really make progress. And it gets back to, I think, both Kameelah hit on this as well as Elisa. There should be substance, right? It's got to kind of really all be aligned and pulled together. So in that, I'm going to shift a little bit to challenges to implementation. So Vanessa, I'm coming to you on this one. You have a lot of experience launching programs to drive that organizational change. Can you talk a little bit about challenges you've experienced in trying to implement the strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. And I would just double click into everything that Katie said, right? When it comes to being able to set up for success and really speak the language of the people that you're working with, right? Being in tech, data is that language, and applying the same rigor internally as you would to your customers or your clients or your partnerships beyond, to Kameelah's point, the compliance piece, right? Really seeing what are we seeing within our people analytics data, as well as our engagement surveys that might be telling the story around that data, right? So looking at the inflection points of the employee life cycle and saying, okay, if we're seeing disparity in promotions or performance reviews for certain populations, what's happening in there? What's the sentiment? What's the engagement on the ground? What's happening within that specific org, getting really granular into it. And I think that that is kind of step one, right? Now, where the challenge comes in is, what do you do? What do you do about it? Who does it? When do you do it? And for me, that's where this shift, to Kameelah's point, over the last 20 years, the last 3 years, the last 3 months in our space, to really start including this equity conversation is so key and critical. This is systemic work, right? And there's a lot of identity sometimes wrapped into some of these systems and processes that people have set up, whether it's, you know, I used to work in a law firm, so it's a centuries old firm with decades old processes, or now working at DraftKings, it's, you know, definitely not a startup anymore. We've gone public, we've grown, we've gone global, but the timeline is less, but there's that much more ownership into these processes. So helping our leaders understand that we did not intentionally build something with disparity. In fact, maybe it's the approach to that system, right? Are there other areas of the organization that you can point to and say, look, they actually are seeing parity in this exact same space or this exact same process? What can we learn from them and adopt into your culture? Because every department, every org has their own culture, right? So we want to maintain that, because that's what's keeping people engaged in the work itself, in the team dynamic. But how do we ensure that there's also parity within those systems? And I think, to Katie's point, it does certainly need to come from the top down. There has to be ownership from the executive team to say, like, yes, we're willing to make these shifts and change. And in fact, we're more than willing. We want to do it because we saw the data, we heard the stories, and we've actually sat and talked with our employees. And we have a one-to-one conversation to better understand what their experience is. And I think that employee, that grassroots, that bubble up is what creates those, like, aha moments, right? Where our leaders are going, okay, this isn't just the dashboard telling me, or this isn't just the comment section of the most recent Pulse survey that went out. This is a person telling me that they felt a certain way about a decision that was made, or they feel a certain way about mentorship at the organization, and how they're able to gain traction with mentors and leaders, and ways that we could do a better job. So really listening to our employees, listening externally, I think is part of the challenge that we need to get people over the hump, right? Like, sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable. But if you can draw it back to, this is the area in the data that we're trying to solve for, and it's only going to help us to have more anecdotal data around that, then we can start putting into place the interventions. I see a lot of, you know, the program managers of this work as consultants to those orgs to say, let's try this thing, right? The data's telling us a story. No company has gotten it like completely 100% right. If we just follow that roadmap that oftentimes engineers are really looking for, if we just follow that roadmap, we'll get it right too. That doesn't exist. And the beauty in tech is that we're always willing to pilot something. We're always willing to try something. If it fails fast. We'll figure something out next. We'll learn from it. And I think that's really what we have going for ourselves. And just doubling down on that will take a lot of those obstacles out of our ways.
That was really impactful what you said, especially around asking the employees how they're feeling. I think that came up for both you and Kate. And so I'm going to come back to Kameelah just to get her reactions to that, because I feel like what I heard was that it's really important to use the data as a starting point, but how do we drill down and get to the root cause? And I think I heard it's a lot about listening. I'd love your perspective, Kameelah, on strategies you've seen to really kind of drive at those root causes and understand what are our people feeling?
Yeah, and before I go there, Vanessa, oh my goodness, let's talk about that roadmap, right? That everybody wants, like, what's the playbook that's going to work for all of us? And as much as you would not apply the same strategy for talent from one company to a next or across industries, you can't even do that within teams in your organization, right? So when we talk about the measurement piece and sort of understanding how to guide people to know what moves they need to make, you absolutely have to listen, Jen, but you have to understand what are the ways that you listen differently for each team, and what are the problems that you're solving for that may be very different for each team. So it is about listening. It is about digging into the engagement surveys. It's also like identifying who your champions are in the organization. You know, when I started with PTC, one of the things that I was really just blown away by was that we've got like over 20 people who have taken this work on globally and really want to see meaningful change happen. So listening, but also finding like your natural champions or your folks who are motivated to do this on top of their day-to-day work, and being able to give them the support that they need to feel like their contributions matter, and also recognizing like these folks want something like sort of meaty to dig into. It's more than just a program, right? They want to be part of that full end-to-end piece. The other thing on listening is like there might be that upfront work, especially for those of you who are just getting started, to do some of the focus groups and maybe engaging a third party to help you with it, because we want to believe that people trust us and that we can ask them and they're going to share with us the real deal, but they may not. And for some of us, we have to earn that trust, particularly if our organizations have not always been at the forefront of inclusion, and where representation might be an issue at the leadership level. You might need to engage folks who have different perspectives to come in and create that sense of safety and trust among your community.
That is an excellent point, and I want to just see if Elisa has anything to add on that. If you'd be willing to share a little bit more about some recent conversations that you've had at Fuze.
You bet. So thanks, Kameelah and Vanessa. I so much more I could talk to you women about, but you know, I kind of agree. The data informs actions. You know, for me, it's a struggle of I don't want to lead with data, really, because what's important to me are people, their feelings, making sure that we are including them in everything. And that's difficult and complex. And if you lead with, you know, one, you have to lead with all things. But Kameelah, I think in terms of, you know, providing and building trust, you know, I struggled with being part of this panel, not because I don't have a passion around this, because I don't care, and because I'm not thinking about it every morning and in every meeting as I'm watching dynamics in the business. But it's because I'm a white female in my 50s with an executive team that's, you know, white and in their 50s, and mostly male outside of myself. So I struggle with, do I have credibility around this? And I really had to reconcile to, I have credibility around and have had success in my career because I care about an organization and it being effective and understanding how to align people to what the business needs and build great teams and high performing teams. But, you know, all that being said, I wasn't used to having very uncomfortable conversations around race, politics, you know, Black Americans being murdered by the police, you know, frankly, and it's affecting my employees, and we've got to be okay with that. So we were lucky enough to, you know, number one, educate ourselves as to what's going on, provide resources for people. But number two, we realized, you know, a panel of, you know, white people in their 50s to address, you know, the latest issue around social unrest and racial injustice in America as an example of our latest occurrence just was something that we needed help with. So we were able to work with Dr. Maurice Stinnett, who ran diversity for the NBA program and the Alibaba group that owns like the Barclays Centers. So he was running sessions with most of the NBA teams, and we have a sponsorship with him. We quickly reached out to him and were able to partner with him to talk to the CEO and myself and say, help us. help us understand how we can have these conversations, how we can look, just like we did during COVID, look our employees in the eye and say, are you okay? How are you doing? What do you need? How can we help, right? We're one Fuze, how can we help? And, you know, he really, and also, by the way, you know, we worked with him to ask us the hard questions. And on behalf of our Black employees today, right? And let's not put the onus on our Black employees today to educate us on what is going on and why we, you know, what we should do about it. So he was really a great partner, right? Not doing it for us, but doing it with us and teaching us how to have these conversations. And the first thing we did was really pull together a group with our Black employees. And we provided them some time to talk with Dr. Ebony Speaks. She's a psychologist who specializes in racial trauma. She's working with police organizations across the country. And, you know, we just had an hour with our Black employees and we had them ask questions ahead of time and we had them share with us just through a Google Doc, you know, what do you want us to know before this? And, you know, we addressed everything they wrote, but she also just provided a service to them. How are you managing yourselves? What does self-care look like for yourself right now? You know, what do you want the organization to know about how this is affecting you right now and what we should know? And so, you know, really powerful time with our Black employees where they came out and said, this was the first time I felt like this was something just for me. I didn't have to work for it. I didn't have to organize it. I didn't have to tell people why this was important. And you know, that really helped us to then go to the entire organization and share some of what we learned and share some of the discussion and have a more broad conversation with the organization, again with Dr. Stinnett for round 2. And he's also helping us with our full DE&I strategy and the levers of that and where we should focus and, you know, how broadly, and he'll call us on being accountable as well. But it was a very, very powerful series of events. And also, as I said, really got us to understand this is no different than talking about other things that we do in the business and how we address other business issues. We're applying exactly the same model. It's just whether or not we're comfortable doing it and whether or not we've gotten comfortable with the subject and educated on the subject so that we can speak to it and start to understand how to drive change.
Elisa, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think it's about getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, and having the conversation anyway. I think we learned really quickly that silence is not an option. And when you know, shortly after the George Floyd murder, it was very apparent, and it brought us back as a firm. So in 2018, PwC lost one of our own employees. So his name was Botham Jean. He was one of our employees in our Dallas market, and he was killed in his own apartment. It was late at night, and off-duty police officer walked into his apartment, thought it was hers, and shot him and killed him. And it hurt our people, whether we knew Bo or not. It was really a difficult time for us to reconcile and understand. And I think silence was not an option. We had to have those candid conversations and support our people who were really hurting. I think that all came front and center again this spring. And so I think, you know, you said a lot of important things, Elisa, like we've done this before with COVID. Checking in with our people, it was no different, and just making sure that we create that safe space for people to have those conversations and support them. And I think that's really important. I'd love to open it up to hear what others are doing around just kind of living those values and supporting employees who are hurting, because I think that's a key part of this. It's just being real and authentic and listening.
I think, so I'd love to jump in on a few things that have been raised. I completely agree, and I share some of your concern, Elisa, as a, you know, white woman and a largely male leadership team. And so I do think a huge drive here is getting uncomfortable, as you mentioned. We started in the wake of the George Floyd murder, a series of conversations we called Change Starts at Home, a play on our brand, obviously, where representatives from across the company, we went on video, calls at Google live stream, and folks from all over our organization, from all different geographies. We had different topics for the call. The first one was about being Black in, the Wayfair environment and in other corporate environments, shared their experience and told those stories that Vanessa, you referenced, to really bring the experience and the stories to light. And incredibly courageous of these folks to share that so broadly with the organization. I mean, we would have 4,000 or 5,000 people streaming into these calls. And we've continued that it's sort of every month throughout COVID. It's actually been, I would say, one of the benefits of all being at home is that everybody can join. And we wouldn't have done them in this live stream way probably if we hadn't been forced to do that, but it created an environment where people could jump in and speak. And we would, we spoke with folks before to make sure that we had them very comfortable for the call. We also had executives on the call to share their experiences and to make sure that they were doing the listening. So I think the listening is so incredibly important. But I want to touch on something else that Kameelah and Vanessa were talking about in terms of, how do you listen, right? And how do you create that opportunity in that space to listen? And one of our challenges is, I think we're the largest in terms of population of employees on this call. We have 16,000 full-time employees, 20,000, including all our part-time, across the world. So we can create as many forums for listening as possible, but I'm not going to be able to actually hear everybody, right? And so how do you listen and pick up that sort of sentiment with some of the advanced data tools that we have? And, given the, just to shift the focus back to data a little bit, I think you can do both. I'm willing to bet that many of you on this call have data science teams in your organization. And a lot of what those folks do is take qualitative, written information, what people are saying, and turn it into something that is actually, data oriented and helpful. So one thing that we did is the data showed us in our performance review some trends that we did not like. And we wanted to understand, why were we seeing these trends? So we actually took the written performance reviews and used natural language processing to understand what was happening in those performance reviews. Now, you do need scale to be able to do that. So that is harder to do when you're 300 people because you don't have enough N of the reviews to make it work. But you could do a similar thing with looking at feedback, written feedback that is given in interviews. And is there bias happening there? What are you actually seeing in that feedback? You could do a very similar thing depending on if your company uses Slack or email to understand the network analyses that are happening and who's talking to who. So these are all ways of listening very important to have that physical act of listening. But if you want to scale that, you've got to use other data tools to understand and listen and pick up that qualitative piece and that language, right? We really think the language in particular that people are using really matters and how we influence that language. And we came up with some very, devastating, uncomfortable things that we picked up in some of these reviews. And, it was hard for us to hear and listen to. And I think the natural reaction too is, when you see and hear things that are not what you expect or that make you uncomfortable, is to start to question that data and to start to try to poke holes in it. And so we've also had to tell people hey, this is what we're actually seeing. And sure, if you took it down to one individual person, you can maybe explain it away, but I don't want to let you take it down to one individual person. This is the power in looking at an aggregate, because I am actually seeing this trend, and in full, this trend should not be happening. It's statistically significant and it should not happen. So I don't want to hear your story about how for that individual person, that performance rating was correct, because you can explain away each one of these, but then you're totally ignoring the overall systemic bias. So I want to share that because I think it's really important that the listening is so critical, but there are many different, we tend to think of listening as very conventional one-on-one, but we all now, the technology is there that we can listen in very, very different ways than we used to. Even, you started the call, Jen, asking what's changed in 3 years. That has changed in 3 years. Our ability to do that and put that in the hands of DEI folks, analysts that are not data scientists, is a totally different space than it was even just 2 years ago.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was very powerful. Seeing everything in the aggregate and really challenging where is their bias. I'd love to see if there's any other thoughts from the panelists and just sort of open it up if anyone has anything to add to that
Yeah, so I really appreciate that, Kate, and we can talk offline because I might know somebody that was part of that analytics development that might just be on my team right now.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Very cool.
All right.
I actually think I know who you're talking about, and it was devastating to lose him.
He's a bit of a superstar out there in the New England area.
For you.
Yeah. But I think what you're also offering is super important for folks to think about the investment in that piece. So when you're starting to build out your DEI strategies, it's, you know, this thinking, there's a rush to think about programming and ERGs and maybe like some kind of full assessment, but investing in people analytics, and if you cannot get a full team, bringing in tools that can help you do some of that work is so super critical. So I'm glad that you said that, and I think it'd be interesting to hear how other folks are making that investment, or at least making the case for it for individuals on the call who are trying to figure out how to get started.
Yeah, Kameelah, I think the investment is so key and critical, right, to create this, you know, gravitas of the work that we're doing, that it's not just, you know, a few people over in the HR team or the people team. And if it, you know, says diversity on it, send it over there. This really has to be something that everyone's invested in, both in time and money. I think, you know, we saw a lot of really great tweets over the summer and charitable contributions, but being able to work with your leadership team to also make those investments internally is what's really going to go a long way. One thing that we did at DraftKings is that we listened to our employees, but we also listened to what people out, you know, our customers were saying, what the athletes were saying, what, you know, influencers were saying. And I, don't quote me, I think it was Arlen Hamilton who said, if you're not going to hire people and you're not going to wire funds, then I don't want to see your tweet, right? And we took that, like, we really listened to that and we ran with it. So we made $1 million investment year over year internally, and we put it into these buckets of like hiring for more representation, but also, you know, in different areas and spaces, thinking differently about our hiring practices as a system. You know, leveraging our platform. So when the NBA returned from their strike, donating all of our profits to the NAACP, the Vera Institute for Justice, Colors of Change, ensuring that we're using our platform responsibly, and then really getting into the infrastructure and the systemic piece here. I think one thing that, from my observation, and I'd be curious to hear others think, that has been really kind of left off the table when we talk about these uncomfortable conversations is the hitting home, right? So when we're listening to our employees about the experience of a Black employee within our organization or a Black employee in our community out in the world, we're a little bit less inclined to talk about what the whiteness means. So Katie and Elise, going back to your earlier comments about being white women in this space, I think one thing that needs to be addressed within the data, within the conversations, is the system of whiteness, right? What it means to be white. We've been talking a lot about what does it mean to be Black in our organization, but our employees, and again, going from the bubbling up, have really turned that conversation, right? And said, how are you talking with your children? How are you ensuring that our board is diversified? And really putting some of that pressure onto our executives. And one of the things that we've really kind of drilled down into at DraftKings is one of our core leadership behaviors is do the right thing, right? It's not talk about the right thing. It's not consider the right thing and contextualize it and make a decision. It's do, right? We have to have this bias for action, if nothing else. So really kind of taking all of the information that we heard from our employees to, you know, kind of shift the conversation with our senior leaders that are in those rooms to really unpack what it means for them to really use our platform. All of that takes investment in time and resources. So I think if you are kind of in those early stages, as Kameelah mentioned, and you're kind of doing some of that analysis on where do we start, you know, pick something big, pick something with, you know, quick wins within it that's going to require accountability mechanisms and a long-term strategy, and then start approaching the business with these topics in the same way that we approach marketing or recruiting or any other area of the business for the dollars and cents to back it up.
I love that, Vanessa. And, I wholeheartedly agree. I think if you're really doing any change, effort within an organization, first and foremost through my career, what I've learned is if the executives are not on board, don't waste time. How are they paid against this? Do they want this change? Do they understand what the change is? And is there executive buy-in and accountability? Once you have that executive buy-in and accountability, there are, for me, 3 big buckets to consider and change. One is communication strategy. What is it? Why is it important? How do we talk about it within an organization? How does this, how is this important to the company, and what does it mean to each employee, and what do we have to do differently about it? And so, you build a communication strategy around it. And you build skills, right? The second bucket of skills and capabilities to drive and lead this change within an organization. What kind of skills and capabilities need to be different? How do we lead inclusively? Where do you put, develop action plans around embedding those skills for the change you want to see within the organization? And the last part for me is business processes. Where are you embedding this in your business process? So this becomes part of how we run the business. How you look at your business every day includes your metrics of your customer sat scores, your metrics of how your people are doing and how diverse is your team, who are you promoting, who are you including on the projects that you run. But it's got to be part of the business cadence where this is, a part of how we talk about the business as well. So for me, keeping things in those buckets to support the change drives it from being an independent program to how do you run the business. And with any kind of change like that, you have to be very intentional, you have to be very consistent, and you have to have fortitude. So, there's not a day that I'm not thinking about how I'm integrating this into the conversation in our executive team meetings. And I'm not the only one, right? So I'm not the executive sponsor here, but I am the steward of the culture, but I'm not the only steward of the culture. So there's the shared accountability. And again, for me, this kind of framework helps me not to lead with any one of the great things we've all talked about, the analytics, but knowing that it's a piece of this complex change. And knowing, by the way, that we're going to screw up along the way. But Vanessa, as you said, right, in tech, we fail fast, and we move on. But we're trying to do the right thing.
Well, I love what you said about the shared accountability, right? It's a business imperative, right? I think I'm hearing that as a consistent theme. There's a CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a platform. There's over 1,300 companies and CEOs who have made that pledge. So it just starts with that pledge, but it kind of gets on them on record that publicly they have made a commitment to advance diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And I know, Kameelah, both of our CEOs have signed that pledge. It's also a space where they can share and collaborate on what's worked and what hasn't, because I started it off by saying this is a collaborative societal problem that we're going to solve together. It's not a competitive one, but it does kind of help us all if we focus on it. And so, Kameelah, I was poking around at PTC's added some items that they've shared on that platform. And one was your CEO, he made a statement that inaction is not an option. And I think that was a powerful message. What actions I'll start with you, Kameelah, but I open it up to the other group. Like, we've talked about a lot of actions that we've seen in our organizations and in our experience, but what would you say would be like the most impactful lesson that you've learned through this journey? If you could each kind of share one important lesson or fail fast so that we can all benefit from hearing that story.
Yeah, I will. And I just want to say one other thing first.
Absolutely. Go for it.
I just wanted to amplify when Elise talked about inclusive leadership. We're actually building out a plan for that right now. So these are real competencies that you can map against. You can give feedback around. A lot of them, when you step back, you're like, oh, this is just what it means to be an effective manager and leader. But people are more apt to listen to it right now because they feel like it's a solution against this diversity thing. So a lot of the times when I come in and I talk to groups or organizations, I offer them solutions that have been there. They're not super shiny and attractive, but when you put this can help with our inclusion issue, all of a sudden it gives light to it. So if you are there trying to struggle around getting investment or budget, and you have people who are really willing to invest in the DEI work, I would say let's do that and then see how that work then goes back to support basic things like people analytics, like your talent management strategy, like, you know, talent acquisition work. So I just wanted to plug that. The number one thing I would say is co-authoring. So whether it's getting your executives involved and having them feel ownership, it's getting the organization at large and employees who are fired up around this work. And the reason I say co-authoring is because I get it. This is a moment. I identify as a woman of color. I am Black. Thank you for paying attention to my community. However, I'm part of a global community. The company I work for, my remit is global for them. And today it's this issue, tomorrow it'll be another issue. We have colleagues who are sitting in parts of Asia and Europe who are also sort of struggling. And if we take this thing on as, okay, we're just going to put all of our energy here right now. Okay, now we're going to focus on this. Oh, wait, what about accessibility? You know, what about, so if you co-author and you bring in these voices, you start to hear the points of intersection and interdependency, which are there. And it kind of goes back to what Kate was saying about that sophisticated listening is going to surface trends about your culture. And if your culture like gets really good at being inclusive around the Black community, but they're failing in other areas, it's not going to move you forward.
That's really powerful. Thank you for that. Kate, on lessons learned or some actions that you think you'd be comfortable sharing?
Sure. So first, I love that point on co-authoring, Kameelah, and I don't think we do that enough, actually. So like, I'm definitely taking that away as something that we need to make sure that we're doing, because I think that's absolutely critical. I think we're still learning a lot of lessons. So so I just want to caveat this all with, like, every day we're stumbling here and learning, and that's okay. And maybe that's the lesson, which is I think it's very important to create an environment where people can make mistakes here, because that encourages people to try. And you need people willing to make that effort to get uncomfortable, as we've all talked about. You know, to give a very tangible example of that, we're talking with some of leadership about, and I should have started off this call with my pronouns. I realized like halfway into the call, I use she, her. We think it's really important to do that modeling of that behavior. And I was talking with some white male cisgender executives who were very uncomfortable using their pronouns. And digging into it, you know, there were a variety of reasons, and we eventually got them there. But I think it's really important to create a space where everybody shares that discomfort and people make mistakes. And I think some of them realize, like, hey, I probably should have been, now that I understand this, like, I should have been doing that a lot earlier. And, you know, I made a mistake there. And acknowledging those mistakes and learning from them is really critical. And so if we create an environment where people don't feel comfortable taking the risk, I think that's where we end up failing. We've recently gotten a lot more comfortable with sharing our data much more broadly within the organization. That's a huge risk. That exposes us, you know, to class action lawsuits, all the way on up to, you know, just general frustration, right? But we're comfortable with that risk because we think progress only comes from taking risks here. And I think that, to me, that has been a big lesson over the past year, is like, let's get, you know, comfortable with the stumble, with the fall, because putting your neck out there is actually really important. And there's too many leaders I find that, you know, won't have the conversation with their team unless somebody from our DEI team is in the room with them. And that's not okay. You just got to start having the conversation. You know, Kiana cannot be all places at all times. So, and you know, I felt that a little bit when she asked me to do this panel for her. I was like, wait, what? I can't sub in for you. But I need to. And so, you know, long way of saying, get comfortable with the uncomfortableness, take the risk, build a culture that allows that.
Thank you so much. That was very powerful. I realize that we've got 10 minutes left. So Vanessa, I'm going to come to you, and then we'll go to Elisa, or if Sarah, if we have an abundance of audience questions, we can get to those if we can. But Vanessa, I would love to hear your lessons learned as well.
Yeah, I would totally double click on what, Kate said, in addition to Kiana being amazing and a rock star, and I hate speaking after her. I feel that as well. But yeah, I think, what I was kind of getting at before was this, not just having conversations for certain demographics or underrepresented communities within that community, but really unpacking what does that mean for the dominant culture, right? What does that mean for the straight, white, cis, able-bodied, 6 foot tall males in your organization, right? That has to be part of the conversation. I think for me, the one big key is that, especially in data-driven organizations, we always look to what does success look like, right? And I would challenge, what does progress look like? And for me, that's an accountability mechanism, whatever that looks like, right? And I think when you say accountability in the DEI space, people automatically go to numericals and quotas and things like that, and there's an allergy there. But there's a lot of science and psychology around social accountability, right? There's a lot of accountability that can come from your board, diversifying your board. We just brought on 3 new board members to help us with that. There's a lot of accountability that can certainly come from transparency in the plan and data and what is, the next 3 years of your organization going to do, and putting that out there and asking people to have those checks and balances. I think, having people within the DEI seats, having that direct line of communication to the entire executive team. For me, it's my executive team, it's my founders, it's my chief people officer. Our 3 founders have really taken very seriously this work and want to do better, which is great. But what happens if you don't have that same investment in your executive team? Who are the few champions that you can get to bring this conversation into that room that maybe you don't have access to, or maybe it's not consistently being brought up? How can you influence that executive or that champion to ensure that on those executive team calls or those executive monthly meetings or whatever it is, that this is a part of the agenda and they are talking about it in some way to keep the conversation moving forward, and then the action will continue to move forward. So for me, it's all about accountability, thinking creatively about what that accountability looks like. To Katie's point, there is some risk that you have to be willing to take here. But thinking a little bit broader than just the numbers and success and what's the milestone that we're trying to hit, to keep the train on the tracks all day long, right?
That's great. No, thank you, Vanessa. Elisa, I'll come to you and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. So, we've talked about so much, and certainly, metrics is a part of the conversation, but there's so much else. I think my reflections at the end of this conversation is, consistency and fortitude. Keep at it. And, I love, Kameelah, this co-author, right? I really have to think through the change agents within your organization. Think through those key influencers within your organization, and think about how we use them as change agents within the organization in a more consistent fashion, in a more intentional fashion. Let's really state, here's the goal here. We want to lead inclusively. We want to, hire the best teams, which naturally means that our team is going to be diverse, right? But we have to teach people what a good team looks like. So let's really think through, again, with intention, who those influencers are, and let's think through how we take them through some education, how we develop the words to talk about this in our organizations, how we get comfortable with difficult or uncomfortable conversations. So for me, my key takeaway, in addition to where we need to make investments around data and structure, it's those key influencers in the org, but then having a very intentional strategy around here, this is how we all need to be accountable, and let's talk through and pilot with you, key influencers, our best leader, process. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And how do we develop the skills and language around that within the organization? So I will pause there, and I'm very happy to be a part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elisa. I feel like the key influencers, identifying those change agents or champions, that sounds like a recipe for success. I think we've all agree there's no formula for improving D&I that applies to every company, industry, or an environment, but it starts with those key folks to get on board. And I like what you said, consistency and fortitude. So well said. Sarah, I think we've got a few minutes for questions, if there's any that you'd like to pose to the panel.
Yes, so I have some specific ones here. I'm just going to read them all together because I think they're pretty quick answers. This one is for Kate. Can you share more about the DEI scorecard? Then for Elisa, can you share the name of the counselor who worked on the racial trauma session? And then for you, Jen, is can you share the little bit more information on the CEO pledge for diversity and inclusion?
Sure. Kate, why don't we start with you on the scorecard?
Sure, very quickly, DEI scorecard covers off on our 3 pillars, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it has metrics around each of those that we track regularly. The DEI scorecard pulls from our human capital database, so that's actually updated every day from our systems. And it's accessible through our talent analytics data visualization platform. We happen to use Vizier for that. Other companies use other things. And so within that scorecard for your team, you can see by race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, a variety of metrics, everything from, as I mentioned before, representation, attrition, engagement scores, performance data to understand if there's inequity in the performance reviews process, questions that we ask on pulse surveys around perception around inclusion and belonging. And the intent is that as a leader, you can pull that up and see where metrics are trending and quickly identify problems throughout the employee life cycle. I think the 2 things that are really just I would hit on if you're going to build this. One, you need to automate it. 2 years ago, we didn't have a way to automate it, so we were like pulling it up every quarter and publishing it, and that's just not good. And 2, your security needs to be quite good on it. And so what we have liked about this is that we can tree it off, so you can double, I can see all of talent. I can actually see all of Wayfair, but pretend that I couldn't. I could see all of talent. The people below me can see their teams. And that's really important because it allows us to share a lot more of the information that we may otherwise be able to share because the security is so good.
Those are excellent points. Just as an accountant, I can agree on the automation and the cybersecurity. So well said, Kate. Elisa, what was the name of the specialist you used?
So we were able to work with Dr. Ebony Speaks, and it's SPEAKKES. Her email is emmasamary.s150@case.edu. She is phenomenal, and please mention that I've referred her.
Excellent. And I think, Sarah, the last question was on the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. And so that is a group of CEOs. Like I said, there's over 1,300 that have signed the pledge. It has a pretty good website, ceoaction.com. I know PTC and PwC, we were early signatories, but we're really excited to get more and more companies to sign the pledge. So there's a lot of great information on that website. I think I've really enjoyed this time with you ladies, and I'm just really impressed by all of the efforts that you've made and the nuggets of information that I know I've taken away from this conversation. So I just wanted to really thank the panelists for your time and for this amazing conversation, and turn it back to Sarah to close out the program.
Yes, thank you so much to Jen for moderating, to Kameelah, Elisa, Kate, and Vanessa. Thank you so much for participating and sharing all of your insights, all of the efforts you've put forth. I really want to again thank you to Wayfair, to Mimecast, to Akamai PTC, and to all of you who have attended today. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah and Jen. Nice to meet everybody.
Yep.